is Dr. Willie Donaldson. Dr. Donaldson is the Associate Professor of Management at Christopher Newport University. He is the Director of the CNU Loader Business Institute and Director of the Biotechnology and Management Program. He has over 35 years of experience as a board member, CEO, president of 8 companies, and has started dozens of others. So once again, I want to turn over the presentation to Dr. McManus.
Well, hello, everyone. It's great to have you here with us today. We've really got a special treat today. We have Willie Donaldson, who is going to be speaking on his book, Simple Complexity. And just as a side note, I know Willie through some of our work that we've done around followership, and we've actually been on a panel together. And I was introduced to this book about a year ago and thought so much of it that we actually embedded it into our systems thinking course that is a part of our Masters of Applied Leadership program. So we're very happy to have Willie with us today to talk a little bit about this book. And in so doing, we'll also get a taste of what we do in the Masters of Applied Leadership program as we think about systems thinking. So Willie, please tell us more about the book and this concept.
Absolutely, Robert. Well, thank you, and Henry as well, and welcome everybody, and thank you for your time. And it's just a real joy and privilege to work with you today. And as I was telling Robert and Henry for the group that just joined, I was dubbed a systems thinker many, many, many years ago. My father gave me the early texts. And as I went on to my management career, I just thought for sure everybody was going to think in terms of systems and use this language. And I was kind of shocked when I found that very few people really knew what I was talking about or really thought about their business as a system. And so I used it in my corporate universities. And what I want to do today is walk you through my sort of thought process of how I came to put these pieces together. And then, as I was telling Robert and Henry, many of my board members, investors, private equity, venture capital folks, and my senior leadership team said, "Wow, you just got a very interesting way of putting the pieces together. You should write a book." So I did, and it's just been a pleasure, and I really enjoy talking about it. And I'm going to encourage you, if you have questions, put your hand up, turn your camera on, and ask away. This is your session. Let's make it as sort of interactive as we can. So, where I'll start is just to remind all of you, one of the things I talk about in the book is that, as humans, we are living in this infinite web of systems and interacting with them in various ways. And so system thinking encourages you to view the world as such. People call it a worldview. And to use systems language and system lenses when we do, and make sure we really are cognizant of the systems that we're embedded in. I'll come back to that again and again. And for those of you who doubt that, I want to share my friend Derek Cabrera's proof, really powerful proof that we're all living in systems. And I use this a lot when I introduce the concept. And he talked it terms it DSRP, and you'll see where that comes from. He talks about the fact that we go through our lives and we make these identities that seem so powerful and important to us in a business context. I'm in sales, I'm in accounting, I'm in marketing, I'm in operations, I'm in finance, and then around the world, I'm an American, I'm male, I'm white, I'm rich, I'm poor, all these identities that seem so really powerful and important, and they are, don't get me wrong. But what Derek asks us to do is to stop and say, is the identity I'm making universal? And if the answer to that is no, you have to then acknowledge the second part of the proof, which is, okay, then there are others. And this is so important. And I wanted my people to understand this as they went through that, okay, just because you're in finance, that's great. But what does that really mean? And what Derek points out is if you come to the conclusion that identity is not universal, I have to acknowledge others. Well, guess what? You're just pretty much 90% of the way to confirming you're in a system, because now you're talking about parts and wholes, right? And you can further confirm that you're in a system by looking at the relationships. If you take an action, will there be a reaction? If you, the CFO, restrict credit, is there going to be a reaction? And you can bet your bottom dollar there's going to be a reaction in the sales department and in the system. And if you go through that, and almost universally we see actions and reactions, and if that's the case, then you're clearly in a system. And what you have to acknowledge is that where you stand in the system gives you a particular view and a particular perspective, which may not be universal. And that's what I really wanted my people to understand is, hey, you're big, you're bad, you're in finance, but, and this is where the both and of systems thinking comes in, both your position in finance is critically important, but so is the whole system. And you've got to understand both. And that was not always universal. And it's one of the challenges in business schools. We break the discipline down into accounting and finance and management, and we basically drive students to try to optimize each of those individually, and that may not be optimizing the whole. So I really wanted to break through that sort of barrier. And I'll give you an example to this day of where the challenges reside. I did a leadership retreat with a major financial institution that many of you on this line would know the name of, probably. And the typical, go off. They wanted to learn more about system thing. I think it was 84 people, if I remember. And I asked them this question, the assembled group, is your enterprise a system? And 84% of them, all the hands went up, absolutely, this business is a system. And then I asked them, is the system that you're in a subsystem of the larger holding company, the parent company? And they all said, absolutely. And then I asked them, is your division or your department or your team? And I just went down this, and again, all the hands went up. Yes, absolutely, we're systems. And then I asked them this really important question. Have any of you ever studied system thinking, system theory, system science, system dynamics, any of the system disciplines? And only 3 of them had ever studied it in detail. So we think we know systems, but we really don't. And this just is indicative of, as I started to be a CEO and lead companies and try to get followers to really understand, it just became so clear you have to give them the perspective of systems thinking and system, because as Barbara Kellerman at Harvard says, a friend of mine, the system sets the context for leadership and followership. So if you're unaware of that, that's going to be a problem. Henry, any comments, or Robert?
Could you explain that just a little bit more? I think that there's a nugget there that I'd like to explore. The system sets the context for in which leadership takes place. I guess my question is, how is that important?
Oh, it's critically important. Just as an example, if we look at academia today, academia is under threat. The long-held beliefs in academia of a never-ending stream of students coming at us, and the only way to teach was to stand in front of the classroom and the sage on the stage, and on and on and on. And there are arising questions about the value of an education, and yet a lot of academia is not responding. Leadership is not really challenging that. The ones that are dramatically changing the way they go to market and the way they look at things. So it changes the leadership and it changes the followership perspectives. And one of the big challenges in leadership is people become well-versed in a particular industry or particular company, and they go to the next company and they just think, I'm going to apply everything I did just the way I did in the last one. Well, no, the context may be different. And what worked in context A may not work in context B. I'll give you an example. I write about it in the book, and that is an institution that I worked with got itself in financial trouble. I was brought on the board, and they brought in all kinds of superior talent from IBM and GE and Procter & Gamble, all who had been trained in the corporate universities, some of the best corporate universities in America, and yet they struggled with coming together with the system of the target company, because the person from Procter & Gamble did it the way they did it at Procter & Gamble, and the person from IBM. And at some point, it's got to be the target company's system, and that context is just different. Does that make sense?
It does. And the example of academe really speaks to me. I'm sure that the business example speaks to others, right? Another thing that you have been mentioning, and you and I have talked quite a bit about this, but I'm not sure all our guests have, followership and the importance of the follower in the leadership process. I think it might be helpful to give us your thoughts on that a little bit
Absolutely.
as we move forward too.
Absolutely. And I'll jump ahead. You'll see this later on when we get to it. It's one of the messages I wanted to send to my team is, here's the deal. Everybody is a follower. I pointed out, I'm the CEO, but I can't just do whatever I want. I report to a board of directors. Wow, even the top guy in the place on the top of the work chart is a follower. And I said, and you're going to be a follower because you report to me. And so you've got to get good at both. You have to be both a leader and a follower. And in fact, I think when you get into unbounded natural systems, followership, I'm writing an article on this as we speak, and Robert, we talked about it in the followership conference. I think it's going to emerge as the most important dynamic as the world faces the huge systemic challenges we face as a population, that followers are going to have to demand. They're going to have to rise and be the people that demand that our leaders get together to solve systemic problems, hunger, resource availability, et cetera, global warming.
I think that follower for so many people has a negative connotation.
It does.
And what I'm hearing you say is it's not a matter of negativity. It's a matter of, as Barbara Kellerman would say, simply who has more influence, power, and authority in a particular situation.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
and that both leaders and followers have to work together in order to get the goal done.
Absolutely.
Not a negative, it's maybe an often overlooked piece of the leadership process.
It is. It's a contextual piece that, and if your people don't understand the language and don't understand that, they will be tipped over. And so in my organizations, we use several different organizational charts. The typical one, which I call the sort of kindergarten snow day call list, is, school's out, so you call these 2 people and they call these 10 people. That's for getting information down. But in my organizations, we actually used a servant leader model with it upside down, and the CEO is at the bottom of that chart, and customers and our beneficiaries were at the top, and our frontline employees were next, because I wanted to send the message, no, those are who are important when you start really thinking about it, because a lot of leaders then equate the hierarchy to power and position, and it has nothing to do with it. It just means you're responsible for one particular area. So I really wanted to break down the egos and the silos in my organization. Robert, you're on mute.
Sorry, I
That's
said
all right.
that's very helpful. Tell us more about systems thinking.
Okay. Well, again, you're living in systems, and what's so important is that both and notion of both. What I'm doing right now is important, but so is the system, and we often lose sight of that. And I'll talk about that more as I go through my slides here. Here's where it really becomes real is, Dana Meadows in her wonderful book, Thinking in System, wrote about the fact that there are no boundaries, right? The only boundaries we have are boundaries of thought and perception and social agreement, right? When I try to drive from Virginia to North Carolina, I don't run into a barrier. I just drive right on through. It's a political boundary that we've agreed on, right? There's not a boundary between accounting and finance. It's just a boundary we've agreed on to say, I have to break it down into its smaller components to be able to make sense of it. And this is what really wigs out a lot of managers and leaders is, wait a minute, you mean it's all connected? And the answer is yes. And you have to understand that, because if not, you'll be sort of tipped over. And it also forces leaders and followers to stop at those artificial boundaries and say, hey, hold it. Is there another perspective I should be including in this decision? And that's so powerful that I really wanted my people to see that. And so you ask, how did we get there? And how do we get to this sort of siloed world? And this is just too complex, right? You cannot deal with the world and everything that goes into it. Well, and same with a company. It's just too complex to deal with all of the stuff that goes on. A church, a university, not-for-profit, same thing. There's a lot of complexity. So what we do is we break it down using reductionist thought into departments and functions and processes and teams and jobs. Absolutely have to do that. I talk about this in the book about the paradox, the management paradox. You have to do this, right, to make sense of it. Nobody can be good at everything you need to know in finance and everything you need to know in sales and everything you need to know in operations, and you can't stay current. But the danger is that now I've put in place those distinctions that Derek Cabrera warned. We put in place boundaries that we know don't exist. And the problem is this is a bounded model, right? And so people start bounding what they do and what they think, and, oh, I'm bigger than you are, I'm taller than you are. And that's a problem. And I wanted to break that down in my organizations. So the paradox is you have to set the boundaries, but there aren't any. And that's where system thinking comes in to get people comfortable with that duality. The fact that how can I possibly be this fully formed entity as well as a completely subservient part? And that's a hard reality to sort of get your mind around. It's a mental model. It's a worldview that I wanted my people to have. And so the reason that those boundaries are so, and distinctions are so problematic is Herbert Simon wrote about bounded rationality. If you start to think that boundary is real because of any of these real problems, is the tractability of the decision problem. I don't know anything about sales, so I'm just not going to worry about it. Or cognitive limitations of your own mind. I've never liked sales. Those people are all just whiskey swilling, backslapping knuckleheads. Time, all of us are, none of us have enough time. Our voicemail boxes are full, our email boxes are full. Or then just the perceived or actual limits of your knowledge. If you didn't know the system was important, you may stop there. And the danger Simon wrote about is when people get that, if they start thinking that boundary exists, they'll start optimizing at that boundary. They'll start optimizing within that boundary. And that's a problem. And they may not recognize that it's a problem for the entire system. In fact, one of the, again, paradoxes that we have is, paradoxically, you may need to sub-optimize finance to optimize throughput through the whole system. And that's just a hard concept for managers to get their head around. Wait a minute, you don't want me to do my best? Well, maybe not. And the example I use from the book is, the owner who comes in and tells his CFO, hey, we need to tighten up on cash flow, for whatever reason, they need a new house in Vail, whatever it is. And the CFO starts to immediately cut down on credit and send people to collections sooner. And that doesn't appear to have an effect for a couple of months. But then people, customers start to get grumpy and they start to switch. And then 6 months later, sales are down and the CEO goes and blasts the sales department and says, hey, you're not working hard enough. Why don't you get sales up? And it turns out it's a finance issue that drove that. And so I really wanted to break through those barriers. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I think the more, I'll give you an example from my world, right? So in academe, we think about our class, our students, as a teacher, right? And that's good. But by doing that, what I hear you saying is we may not be thinking about someone else's students. We may not be thinking about the athletes. We may not be thinking about other types of students. You know, if we only see our students that are 18 to 22, we may be missing the students that are, let's say, coming back later in life for school. And that you have to have this much more, a much wider view. That's not an easy task.
It's not.
How would you recommend us to start thinking more with a systems way of thinking?
Well, that's the perfect lead in. That's precisely why in my corporate universities, we did systems thinking as one of the very first modules, was to get people to understand, because as the example I used from the financial services firm, that was done 18 months ago. So here's a company, a well-known financial institution, where their senior leadership doesn't know anything about real systems thinking. And so I'm working with them to set up a systems thinking module in their corporate universities. And it's been a revelation for their people, like, oh my God, why didn't somebody tell us this years ago? So the first thing is awareness. You've got to make somebody aware of the problem, Robert, and then you just have to have language and common mental models that people can use to explain the phenomenon.
Yeah, that
But
common.
it's interesting that you bring up academia. I'm going to forget the name of the gentleman who wrote a book called The Systems Approach and Its Enemies, C. West Churchman. And maybe you can guess, or our guests on here can guess, the top two slices of society that didn't want to take a systems approach. Any ideas? Politicians and academics. Right? The politicians don't want you to know how the system works and don't want you to know that you have to think about the Democrats or the Republicans. And academics, we love our swim lanes and we love to have our academic freedom and not have to think about the other areas. So those are the two biggest enemies of a systems approach.
That is fascinating. We actually have a question here in the chat.
Okay.
We had two, I think we might get to the other one, but here's one. Since the 1960s and Jay Forrester, I've used systems methodologies in operations management, financial modeling, and demand forecast modeling. You seem to only apply the process to modeling human behavior. What have I missed?
No, that's a great question. And I apply it to both. I mean, it is both the economic behavior, financial behavior, but what gets left out a lot is human behavior. We want to blame humans and we want to blame parts and make those distinctions. And often behavior is driven by the system. Right?
Mhm.
People want to do the right things. It's the system that causes them to not do the right things. Often W. Edwards Deming, famous systems thinker and statistician, found that upwards of 94% of all the mistakes, flaws, misunderstandings, defects were systemic. And if you think about it, if you hired good people whose heart is in the right place, they want to do the right thing. Well, why did they do the wrong thing? Often it's due to misaligned incentives, bad systems, et cetera. So going back and looking at the system is always important, but you also have to keep in mind people. And if you look at the Gallup poll results, where upwards of 68% of all the employees surveyed say that they are either disengaged or actively disengaged at work, that's a management and leadership failure, right? We don't have a system that engages them. We haven't figured out how to get that human potential unleashed. So great question.
I know we've got a short time, so please go to the next slide.
Yeah. So, I'll very quickly go through these. One thing that struck me as I thought about this problem is, how do I think about this notion of, I've got this whole, but it's much more comfortable for me to do the parts. And I read about a tradition called hermeneutics. And that is, it's impossible to understand the part that you're playing if you don't know the whole, because the whole gives you the context of the part, but it's impossible to know the whole if you don't know the part. So you have to go around that circle again and again and again to really get comfortable. And all of your listeners on here will know this. If you've ever read a book or a novel or seen a movie and you're halfway through, you know some of the plot lines and some of the arc of the story. But when you finish, it's like, oh, okay, now I see how it fits together. And then if you read the book again or you see the movie again, now you'll see subtleties and nuances that you never saw the first read. And so if you stop, the caution is if you stop at only the parts, you know, your worldview is going to be tipped over. And so I thought about that. I said, okay, we've got to teach system thinking. And then I was introduced in high school and college to the Mobius strip, which I'm sure most of leaders, and that it's endless and there are no sides. And for those mathematicians on the call, you cannot mathematically model, you cannot get oriented to a Mobius strip. You have to orient yourself. You know, there's not a way you can model it. So you have to look at the totality to get yourself oriented and see and understand what you're viewing. And so that's why I drove this notion of, you know, using a stylized Mobius strip. And then Arthur Koestler's concept of a holon, he dealt with this question of how do I simultaneously think about being a fully formed part that can act interactively that's also subject to this greater whole. And he proposed this notion of a holon. And that's just, again, a mental model that caused people to stop and say, okay, yes, I have these activities, and yes, I'm a leader of this particular area, but I also have to remember my connection to the system because a holon never loses its systemicity. And then holism, teaching people about systems dynamics, can only be, you know, used if you catch yourself and stop yourself and ask those questions. And so if you look at that, this is where the book, you know, really starts to tell you, we take this Penrose triangle, this stylized Mobius strip, and take the elements and the interactions and the purpose, and that's a pretty good, you know, systems diagram. And the reason for that is if you don't share that, you see when the ball goes away, you'll think, oh, that's not important. It doesn't work. And so I wanted my people to see that. And you know, I looked at people coming in, and in my experience, I saw people that were all over. And this person, oops, sorry, you go back one. This person may be a terrific individual, but they're clearly not adding value to the company at this particular time. And where we want to get everybody lined up. And so there's a wonderful Sufi parable in system thinking about, you know, the blind men who see an elephant differently. If you don't give them a whole, they're going to have conflicting mental models. Now, I write about this in the book with the 7 people in the C-suite of a government contractor who each had a different mental model of what government or of what project management was in their company. It's fatal. It's not helpful. And so I wanted to build common mental models and common language and, you know, get the arrows aligned. And so if you look at this as a systems mental model, what the aha moment for me was, now I've got this really cool fractal image that is almost universally applicable. So that's a great model for the whole system. It also represents a division of a company. It also represents a department, right? The accounting department, accountants and finance people interacting with the purpose of making sure our books balance. It looks like a project, time, people, money focused on a particular purpose. It looks like a team component. And it looks like an individual. You know, I have an individual who is an element who interacts with this particular purpose. And that could be the one person in a small company who runs the shipping department. And this gets back, Robert, to our discussion of leader and follower. In that case, that person is a follower in the system, but also a leader in the system. And so I wanted to make sure people understood the profound nature of systems thinking in that regard. And you'll see how it becomes so important, because where is anybody going to get their direction in the system? And that's from their interaction with the higher purpose, the higher level, board of directors down. And this is the failure mode, is not making sure that that is really clear and that the direction is maintained. And so back to our point is everyone is a follower and everyone's a leader. And that's just something, that's a message I wanted to get across.
I
Go ahead.
really appreciate that idea of everyone being a follower and everyone being a leader in regards to this systems thinking. Would you go back one slide? I want to make sure, or maybe 2 slides. One more. Yes. Okay. So this is what I'm hearing is that the purpose has to be central to the organization. And
Absolutely.
everyone has to understand the purpose. And then tell me a little bit about, because I'm not sure if I've got it, the importance of the interaction and the elements.
Yeah. So you're going to have the elements, whether you bring them into the system and whether you bring them into alignment. And I love the English language word of being at cross purposes. That's where a lot of organizations come adrift, not-for-profits and for-profits, where people are working at cross purposes. The sales team is trying to sell all they can when operations is struggling to get out anything. Or they're selling and they don't have the cash to support the sales and operations. So making sure that you have alignment and purpose and that the interactions are designed to drive on that purpose, because often they're not. We've seen it all the time in organizations where somebody's doing something that's really not helping the system. They think they're doing a great job. They think they're being helpful, but it's actually at cross purposes with the system. So making sure you have the discussion of, are they the right elements, or do we have the right people, the right systems, the right tools? Are those interactions, effective, and are they working well, and are they aligned with the purpose, and constantly having those discussions? Does that help?
It's starting to. Again, this is a language, right? There's a
Yes.
whole nomenclature for
Yep.
this. So I'm thinking about the purpose. I'm thinking about how the interactions can be aligned or encounter to the purpose, and then the elements, right? So I'm starting to understand this a little bit more. Explain some more, and I'll catch up as we go.
Yeah, so one of the ways I'll explain it is, using one of the tenets of systems thinking is the elements by themselves do not constitute a system, right? If I have a collection of employees, that doesn't mean they're a system, because they may be at cross purposes. They may not know what they're going to do. One of the things that systems do is people will seek a purpose. And if you're not clear on what that purpose is, those people are going to make it up. The hermeneutic circle tells us that. They're going to complete the circle and say, oh, well, Dr. McManus brought us in together to do this. Maybe not. So we've got to be very clear to make sure people know what that is, and then make sure that their interactions are holistic and really work and benefit. Because the other thing is, they will self-assemble and start doing things. Are those the right things that you want them to do? Right? And do they align with the purpose? So does that help?
It does. That was very, very helpful.
Okay.
We've got about, probably 10 more minutes before we start opening up for questions. So
I'm
I want
just
to make sure that I
about
don't
done.
take too much of the time.
Yeah. So as you can just see this cascading down, and then the critical region becomes making sure as a leader that you're picking the right people and the right elements, and making sure those interactions are clear, and that you're very clear about the purpose before you go down. Because you can see the problem as you start to cascade down, and I see it in my consulting practice all the time, where departments and leaders start to draw apart and get just a little bit off. It doesn't have to be much, but that just ends up being friction and anger and frustration. And it doesn't have to be that way. And so you can also see the critical region with your vendors, or, between vice presidents. They got to get along, and they got to make sure that they're connecting, because the interaction of an individual to the team, they're going to be an element of the team. And you got to make sure, again, all of these things have to be sympathetic, and you have to make sure that you're taking a holistic approach to these. And I use and write about it in the book, the OODA loop, which I love. John Boyd was actually a friend of my father's, and he was a fighter pilot. And a lot of people said, how does that fit? But he pointed out the OODA loop is getting, and observing your context is critically important to get yourself oriented. Because if you decide without doing this well, there's a chance you're disoriented, and deciding when you're disoriented is not a good place to be. But what he will tell you, and what I will tell you, and I've had CEOs tell me when I show this, I say, yep, we jump in right here at Decide.
Mhm.
That's where a lot of leaders jump right in at decide. Make sure you get yourself observing really on, get yourself oriented, because if you don't do this well and you're disoriented, no decision's going to be helpful in that regard. And so that's where I really wanted the hold on and the systems thinking to have my people stop and say, okay, look, let me go observe and get myself oriented before I make that decision. And so if you look at this, to tip it over sideways, we can apply it back to my sort of energy diagram. And so here you get, leadership and governance and planning are what give you the purpose and the vision for the company, and that gives the direction. And if you aren't clear and don't get these system elements right, all right, maybe you're pointed in the wrong direction. And there's certainly a lot of institutions of higher education that seem to be pointed in the wrong direction these days. And then interactions and behaviors get guided by leaders and values and culture. No amount of writing is going to overcome. You can post all the values you want. If leadership doesn't walk the talk and lead by example, people are going to make their own decisions. The example I use is I went on Enron's website the day they filed for bankruptcy, and their values were on their website. Transparency and honesty and integrity, and all of it was nonsense, right? So leadership has got to stand tall here. And then the thing that enables the systems is these visible subsystems, and you have to constantly check to see that the interactions are correct and the right structures in place and that the system itself is yielding. And then you bring in to this system of systems, you bring new entrants in and train them in your systems. And I even select for them. I've had people applying for jobs in my companies, and when I showed them the upside down servant leader model with me and VPs at the bottom, they pushed it back and said, I don't want to work here. Well, they like the power, they like the prestige of being called vice president, but it doesn't matter. And so I didn't want those people in my institutions. And so the book ends with, these are the most common elements that you'll find if you look at McKinsey's 7S model and the American Management Association and a number of the management models. All these 7 elements come up again and again and again, which is evidence of a systems archetype. And you got to make sure everybody understands each of these in the way you talk about it and the way you think about it. And so you have to realize it's a system of systems. You have to communicate in that language. And that's why our corporate university was designed to bring people in. And the reason this is so important for leaders and followers, and this is work that Mobius Kaufman did and friends of mine. And if you think about a CAST, a complex adaptive socio-technical system, which a university is, a business is, a church is, you have these relationships, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of relationships in some cases. That's what makes them complex. And so you've got to understand it's not the elements, it's not the person, you got to understand those relationships and the interactions. And the challenge is they're constantly adapting because people learn and they see and they grow and they see the outside world. So they adapt over time. And so that's where you've got to keep going back and saying, do the relationships hold up and do the structures hold up? And they do that by encoding knowledge and transferring information. And so is it consistent? Are people all getting the same and the right message, et cetera? Are they getting the wrong message? And that leads them to, evolving at multiple scales and multiple rates. And that's what makes this really hard. And particularly if you're not treating it as a system, you can see where you can get it cross purposes, because that leads to very different flow dynamics and transfers of energy. And one of the group is ready to go marching off to yay verily to do this, and another saying not on my watch, and you get these organizational elements at cross purposes.
So what do you do when that happens? I mean, I'm thinking of how that may be happening in organizations that I'm in currently, right? As a leader, how do you get everyone rowing in the same direction, if you will?
Well, by going through just what we've said, making sure everybody views the world the same way, speaks the same language, et cetera. But the danger in that is what a lot of corporate universities fell into is just building groupthink. Okay, this is the only way you can think about it. So we also built in time in my organizations to stop. So every third Thursday, everything stopped and we said, what's not working? What would we do differently? What's going on in the outside world in our context that means we should change everything? Tell me what you're grumpy about. And making sure you go back and constantly revisit the system and make sure it is set for its context. And that's one of the things that we changed, the delivered wisdom in academia forever, that this was the only place that you could go to get a better life in America. Well, that's nonsense. It hadn't been true for years, but we kept believing that old lore. And a lot of companies just fall into that trap of, you've heard it, this is the way we've always done it. Well, maybe you should think about doing it differently.
Mhm.
So you have to intentionally think. I use red team thinking, if anyone's familiar with that concept from the military, where challenge your most firmly held beliefs, challenge yourself. Why is this wrong? Why is it right? What would we do differently? And not enough leaders do that. Not enough leaders create an organization where followers feel empowered to put their hand up and say, hey, this isn't working, and we should talk about it.
It seems to take time. It seems to take intention, right?
Absolutely.
I think we get so busy doing the daily things that we have to do
Mhm.
that many times we don't take the time to think what is in this context, what's in the system,
We don't.
what might have worked 10 years ago but is not working today.
Exactly. And
Right.
it's the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. It's okay, we strive to be efficient. Well, that may not be effective. And so, going back to what I said about the Gallup poll results, if you think about, if we could unleash that 68% of the people who are idle essentially and don't know how to add value, think about what happens. Anecdotally, when I've taken my clients through setting up a corporate university and running their business as a system, anecdotally, they tell me they feel like they get back 30, 35, 40% of their time because people are all rowing in the same direction.
Mm.
But it does take time, and most people don't want to do that.
Yeah. Do you have a few more slides?
Yeah, this is the last one. So this is my last company, PAR, Piezo Application Research. We commercialized the technology out of NASA. And you'll notice that the very first module was critical and then systems thinking. So critical thinking was making sure people understood their own mind and the limitations of their own mind and how to think about things in groups and individually. And then that, hey, you're living in a system, you got to understand that. And then we went through all of our systems and the important sides of it. So see how easy this stuff is?
Well, let me tell you this. As we were mentioning before, I've read a lot on systems thinking, and your book has really helped simplify it for me. I think that what is the sub name? It's Systems Thinking, a Management Guide for the Rest of Us.
Yes.
I liked that.
Yeah. And
All right. I'm going to invite everyone that would like to, please turn on your camera, turn on your microphones. What questions do you have for our guests, Willie, today? And if you would be more comfortable putting your questions into chat, that's certainly fine too, and we can do that as well. Well, what questions might we have for today?
So Robert, we had a question earlier from one of the participants, and they said we all have good bosses and bad bosses. How do you measure the intensity of followers?
Yep. Great question. And so a couple of techniques I write about in the book, and I would commend to you, is one, there's an exercise that I use in every one of the companies I run or work with. And that's, if you get people to sit down and with a clean sheet of paper, write what they believe good leadership is and bad leadership is, you will always get the same list. No one ever says good leaders are grouchy, demanding, insensitive. You always get the same list. And that very powerful thing happens then. Now you can say, okay, you aspire to be a leader in this company, do that. And then what we've done is converted that. Typically, there's a scale on those things, rate people. And so then you get into the notion of 360-degree reviews. And so my people would get rated on how good a leader they were. And if they didn't perform well, I was going to bust them on that. So and sometimes, you know, I hate to say it, you have to have a going away party for bad leaders, because if you don't, that's on you. Does that help?
It
Yeah.
does help. I see one of our friends is actually laughing the going away party for bad leaders.
You know, I hate to say it, folks, but you know, as CEO of 8 companies and unofficially 3 more as chairman of the board and in an acting capacity, I got really, really good at firing people, and I'm not proud of that. I still don't like it, but you have to. If you don't get rid of a person that's violating your values or treating people poorly, that reflects on you. That's on you. You got to get rid of those people. It just goes with the territory.
I guess a question, and I do open this up for anyone that has a question, please just, jump on in. I guess a question that I have is if you are a follower in an organization, you don't know what the organization's purpose is, or the leader is not holding the standards that everyone would agree on are appropriate. And as a follower, you don't have a great deal of authority, power, and wisdom or influence. What do you do in order to help that system get on the right track?
Well, you know, Robert, that's a great question, and that's the dirty little secret is a lot of CEOs and directors of HR and VPs of HR don't want to build a system that allows people to speak truth to power. You have to do that. You have to empower people to tell you you don't have any clothes on, and that's hard to do. And a lot of leaders don't want to do that. But you know, making sure your HR director or VP of HR knows that he or she is responsible for collecting those sorts of behaviors, and you've got to train people to step up. And a technique that I used when I found that my people, we'd have a all hands meeting and nobody was asking questions, I would get with Dawn Wilson, my ex-VP of HR, and I say, Dawn, what are the things people are worried about in your mind? And she would tell me, and so occasionally I would plant a question and say, hey, folks, if I were you, I would be worried about, I ran a lot of venture-backed or private equity-backed companies. I would be worried that we're getting ready to be sold. Is anybody worried about that? And lo and behold, a couple of hands went up. I was like, great, well, let's talk about that. And then you have to deal with, yes, we are venture-backed, or yes, we're private equity-backed. And that may happen, but as of right now, it's not happening, right? And you just got to go about your job. So, I think you've got to train an organization to be willing to speak truth to power and to be able to accept that. That's hard to do.
What other questions might we have here?
So then, Willie, we had another question in chat box, and the presenter, the audience had mentioned total alignment throughout organization is key. While all contribute input, who decides the driving priorities and resolves differing viewpoints?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and in fact I cited in the book the chairman of Motorola was a dear friend of my father's, and I got to know him, and he pointed out that the leader can and is empowered to make all of those decisions, but if you can possibly back away and let your team deliver those decisions to you, in which you just say, yay, verily, folks, what can I do to help you get there? So I'm a big fan of team-based strategic planning and making sure that those issues rise up, because what you could or should do typically becomes very clear, and then it's not having to make those. Now, that being said, there are times you just have to make very, very tough decisions, and you can't push those back downhill. Sometimes you just have to step up and say, sorry, folks, this is the direction we're going to go. The other thing I think not enough leaders do is if you step into that role and you do take that you're going to have to answer the question why. A lot of leaders like, I don't want to answer that, and I'm the big boss, and it doesn't matter. People are going to ask that question why, so you might as well go ahead and answer it for them. Give them the rationale. That builds your case. Is that helpful? Other questions or thoughts?
I think about organizations that you have organizations are coalitions, right? And they have these different groups. As a leader, what do you do when you've got one group that wants to go in one direction, and you've got another group who wants to go in almost a 180 from that direction?
Yep.
How, I mean, you have to, I would imagine, get them going in the same direction, but they have very firm beliefs and why they have the, you know, the thinking that they do.
Yep.
How do you as a leader get them to go in the same direction? And maybe a different direction than either of them want to go in,
No,
right?
it's a great question. And I used a technique that Edward DeMono popularized called the 6 thinking hats. And so, you know, in that example, you got 2 different teams, you know, get them to state their cases. And then often I would get them to reverse and say, okay, you now have to defend that team's approach. You've got to go learn enough about it and understand and defend why they would come up with that and make them switch. And what I found in doing that exercise repeatedly is they agree on 90% typically, and it's the 10% they're fighting about. And once they recognize how much they share in common, it's like, oh, okay. But then also that's the nature of systems. You have to make trade-offs, and then you get to the least worst trade-off. And there's a technique of, you know, sitting on a teeter-totter. Let's weigh the pros and cons of this and the trade-offs. There's a great tool. One of the people asked about, Forrester, who talked about it. Excuse me, a trade space analysis. Be very clear of what you're trading off and why you're trading those things off, and then weigh that teeter-totter and say, okay, that decision makes the most sense. And then people feel empowered. They feel like they're part of it. And then the final piece that a lot of people forget about is once the group has made a decision and or the CEO has said, yay, verily, that's what we're going to do, heard everything you have, then everybody has to salute and say, aye, aye, Captain, we're going that way, and put their shoulder to the wheel to get there. And if you can't do that, hand in your resignation right then and there. You know, Henry, you were a football coach. Imagine a team breaking from the huddle and the left side of the line says, you know what, this is a stupid play. We're not going to block for it. Can't work. And that play will never work. And you'll never know if it was the right play or not. The team has to come together. And if you can't do that, it's one of the things I read about in governance. I see a lot of boards where, you know, it won't go the right way. And then the people are chatting to the CEO and doing destructive things. No, if that's the direction we're going, get your oar and start rowing. If you can't do that, give your oar to somebody else.
I wonder if you could expand a little bit on how you can employ the OODA loop. That when you put that up, that really resonated for me. And it didn't take me long to come up with about 5 really bad decisions that I made along the course of time where I just missed the double O's on the front side.
Yeah, John, it's a great one. And the big thing is getting people to stop. And if they're so convinced of their power and their authority and their rightness, they're just going to make that decision. But and that's where you've got to train the mind to stop and say, hey, hold it. Have I really thought of all the consequences? And so that's why, again, the very first module we taught was critical thinking, and then the systems thinking, to get people to stop and say, have I really gotten myself oriented to this? And have I really observed deeply enough to make sure that this is going to be the right decision? And also another thing you can add is second order and third order effects. All right, great. You made that decision. What are the consequences? We can readily predict what the consequences are, and not enough people think through those because everything in the system is connected. So there are going to be consequences. You got to think through those. Does that help?
A lot. And I would just add this little thought because it plays into it. So many of the leaders that I've worked with over the years are call them alpha types. They're D's. They're the dominant type, and they seem to have that quality of they absolutely have to have the final say.
Yep.
And they absolutely know they're right. And so there's a resistance to the vulnerability of not having the final say and admitting I made a mistake.
Yep.
And I agree with you. The getting them to see the personal awareness that is a double-edged sword. They need that thing to be successful, but it's also the other edge of the sword where it can really cut them.
No, John, you couldn't be more right. And I had actually a very good friend, and we did a lot of business together. He tried to hire me a number of times, and I said, I'll never work for you. And he said, why not? And I said, because you are the alpha of all alphas. You have to be right. Now, he founded 3 companies, took all 3 of them public. But if you didn't do it Ken Olson's way, you were, if people lived in the same communities and drove the right cars and wore the same suits. And I said, I'd want nothing of that. That's not me. But he was very true to himself. He told people, I'm in charge. I'm going to tell you what to do. If you like that, I'm going to make you very rich. And that worked for him. But at least he was true. And he didn't come across as saying, oh, yeah, come in here. And if your kid's got a soccer game, it's okay. Nonsense. Come in here, put in 24 hours a day. That's what I do. So at least he was honest with himself about it. The ones that really bother me are the ones that demand that, but will not look in the mirror and see the impact that they're having on their people.
Well, Willie, this has been an outstanding conversation. One other comment was in the chat, agreed. It is hard when you have an authoritarian leadership style, right? To be doing some of the things that you're suggesting and empowering people. And yet it is a time, it seems, when, okay, we've had the discussion, we've got to move in a way.
Yeah.
And then everyone has to do that.
Yep.
We are very close to our time.
Robert,
Yes.
if I can follow on with that and share this last anecdote with this wonderful crowd. I had a dear friend who I went to business school with, and we started a company together. He'd never been a CEO, and he'd never done a lot of the investing work that I'd done. So I got him set up, and I was chairman of the board, and we found out that he really liked to be in charge. He'd gone through the Naval Academy. He loved, that sort of military leadership style. And we had an intervention with him. And for those of you on the line, do you remember how the man of La Mancha, they brought him to his knees? Anybody remember the story there? Here's this old tired knight who's charging off to do great things in the world. Anybody remember how they broke him? They surrounded him with mirrors, and he saw that he was an old tired knight, and it broke his spirit. And so I got the people together, and I just sat down with Bill, and they said, yeah, this is not working for us. And to his credit, he humbly said, wow, I missed the boat, and I'm going to do better. And that's the key. If you, as a leader, if you don't do the right things, you got to apologize. You got to go and publicly say, I screwed up. And that's where that continuum comes in, and rating leaders on it. If they're off the charts on a particular thing, you got to go deal with that. So I hope that helps.
It helps a great deal. Thank you so much, Willie. And thank you to our guests for being a part of this today. Henry, did you have any last words regarding the programs?
Yeah, so I encourage everyone to visit our website to look at the other pre-recorded sessions we've had on lessons in leadership from that past November. till this one. I encourage you to also visit our master's and doctor of applied leadership programs if you are interested in becoming a member of our university. And definitely contact myself or Dr. McManus to move forward with your interest levels. So again, I want to thank Robert and Willie for your presentation, and thank everyone for being here today. It's an outstanding presentation. You have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, folks.
Thank
Good
you
luck.
so much, Willie. Thank you, everybody.
My pleasure.